In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. It's a pleasure to be with you here again. This is episode 65, and I have the distinct and great pleasure of not being in our studio again like last week. Last week we were at the Moody Church interviewing Dr. Clay Jones, and the episode was on the problem of evil and suffering. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, I want to encourage you to go back into the website, or if you download the podcast on iTunes or Google Play, go back into the episode list and listen to that. Well, today I'm joined by none other than Fazale Rana, or Fuz as his friends call him. He is the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe, which is a science-based apologetic ministry and organization in Southern California. Fuz, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Kurt.
It's good to see you. I know it's been a few years since we've seen each other.
Yeah, it has.
And so I'm very pleased to have you here, and I want to thank the local RTB chapter and then Ginger Creek Veritas for sponsoring this event. We are at Ginger Creek Community Church today, and if I were to turn the camera around, you'd see there are about 30 or so people here in this wonderful, nice little gathering room, as they call it. It's different than the other classrooms that Bob Clapper has had. So, all right, so today we're going to be talking about how we can integrate science with our faith, and how the two are not mutually exclusive notions, as much as some atheists might like to suggest. But before we get into some of the scientific aspects to that, tell me a little bit more about yourself and your family background and what got you interested in science.
Sure. Well, I have somewhat of an unusual family background. My father was born in India. He was a Muslim, and he was born prior to India winning its independence from Great Britain. Well, and as a Muslim, when that happened, he was forced, along with his family, to immigrate to Pakistan. He's a PhD in nuclear physics. He died a few years ago now, but came to the U.S. via Canada, and he met and married my mom, who was from a Catholic background. She was a non-practicing Catholic. And typically when a Muslim marries a non-Muslim, they're supposed to convert, but my father was more progressive in his views, and so he didn't expect that of my mother, but she was really a rather non-religious. So I grew up in a home where my father was a practicing Muslim, deeply committed to Islam, and that was what I was exposed to growing up. A home where my mom was a science and math teacher, and so a lot of science and education was very much important, and Islam was the religious system that I was exposed to. So that's where I come from, and I didn't have much interest in science as a young man. It was basically sports, rock music, and girls, right? That's what I was interested in growing up. But I was a really good student, and my father, being a domineering Indian father, expected me to go to school and to become a medical doctor. So I enrolled in a pre-med program out of high school, and my first course in biology is what hooked me. The first day of class, we talked about the question, what is life? And I learned that biologists can't define what life is. We can describe it, but we can't define it. And right from there, we went into a discussion of the molecular systems that constitute life. And at that point, it was like, okay, I'm hooked. Biochemistry is the coolest thing in the world. And suddenly I had this real love for science, and it's persisted since that day.
And so is that how, even just gaining that exposure to science, is that how science sort of played a role in your faith journey? What brought you over to belief in God?
Yeah, well, by the time I had graduated from high school, going into college, I was an agnostic. I didn't know if God existed or not, and I didn't care. And becoming enamored with biochemistry, my focus was doing everything I could to prepare myself to go to graduate school to get a PhD in biochemistry. So I was thoroughly entrenched as a science nerd from that point on. But and I embraced the evolutionary paradigm. Professors I admired deeply still do to this day, basically taught that life's origin and history and design comes from the work of evolutionary mechanisms. And I accepted those ideas more so on the authority of my professors rather than on a critical evaluation of the evidence. And I meet a lot of college students that embrace the evolutionary paradigm for that very reason. It's not that they've drawn that conclusion themselves, that this is what the evidence supports, but rather it's really a quasi-indoctrination. And of course, if we're going to be scientists or if we're going to appear to be educated, then we embrace evolution because that's the mainstream view. And it was really in graduate school where that idea that life could originate through evolution was challenged for me.
So, what scientific evidence played a role in bringing you to belief in God?
Well, it was just the sheer beauty and elegance and sophistication of biochemical systems. These systems are clearly complex, but to me the complexity wasn't what was so fascinating. It was that the systems display an ingenuity. They're just so cleverly put together. And it was not uncommon as a graduate student to talk to other graduate students that were working on their PhDs in biochemistry, and we would sit around just talking about how cool and how amazing biochemical systems are. And it's day after day after day where you're learning something new about the cell's chemistry, or even are playing a role in discovering something new that would never appear in textbooks until years and years later, if at all. But as these discoveries were happening, it's like, okay, how on earth do scientists really explain where these systems come from? And that's the origin of life question. So I remember as a graduate student, on my own, digging into the literature, trying to understand how to explain the origin of life. And when I saw the explanations that were being offered, to me I felt like those explanations fell far short. And so now you've got 1 + 1, where you've got design, and you've got an inability to account for that design through mechanism. The only conclusion is there's got to be a mind that somehow initiated life's origin.
Yeah, a designer. Okay, but that wouldn't bring you to Christianity.
No.
And so tell us about your journey into embracing the Christian faith and why Islam, being sort of, part of your family heritage, wasn't an option for you.
Yeah. Well, when I was a teenager, before graduating from high school, I spent a couple of years actually exploring Islam under my father's tutelage. And I partly was motivated in doing that was just to try to connect a little bit with my roots, my family history, try to connect a little bit with my father. And so I began to read the Quran, and I learned how to pray. And I would spend about a year and a half every day praying in a dedicated manner as a Muslim would pray. And prayer is very different in Islam than it is in Christianity. In Christianity, prayer is an opportunity to be in the presence of God and to commune with God and to communicate with God. In Islam, prayer is an obligation. It's something that you're doing in order to earn Allah's pleasure and Allah's approval. And you never are quite certain if what you're doing is pleasing to Allah, but that's the motivation. And so it's not, it's an obligation. And as a young man, that became tedious. Okay, this is just another thing that I have to do. And trying to read from the Quran wasn't very helpful either. It just seemed to be, to me, rather esoteric as I read from it, and there wasn't a lot of meaning. And so by the time I left high school, I was, again, an agnostic, but I was pretty much certain that Islam wasn't going to be the way to go. But interestingly enough, I was going down a path of universalism. I kind of reasoned, well, why couldn't God have revealed himself to different people at different times in different ways? And that idea actually is very Islamic, believe it or not, because Muslims view, Noah and Moses and David and Jesus as being prophets to specific people at specific times, and Muhammad is the last of the true prophets. And so this idea of kind of a religious pluralism is kind of intertwined in Islamic theology, and so being exposed to that made sense to me that I would go down that path of universalism. And I reasoned, well, look at the world's religions all teach the same thing, more or less, from a moral standpoint. And it was the woman that I was engaged to that became my wife that was key in getting me to seriously entertain Christianity. She grew up in a Christian home, drifted away from her faith, and then rededicated her life to Christ at an Easter service, and she began to share with me. And I remember my first reaction was like, hey, if you want to be a Christian, that's perfectly fine with me. I don't have any interest in that. Yeah. But the pastor in her church was going to marry us, and she was concerned going through a Bible study that she would be unequally yoked. And so she was really going through a crisis. And so this little tiny Pentecostal church in downtown Charleston, West Virginia, I don't even know the name of the church to this day. I just remember calling it Johnny and Sherry's church because they were the pastors. But that church began to pray for me. So I was the prayer project. So the whole church knew. Yeah. And so I remember meeting with Johnny, and to his credit, he didn't press. He just said, look, how do you know that Christianity is not true? Have you ever read the Bible? No, I've never read the Bible. Well, why don't you read the Bible? Mm-hmm. And so I read through the Gospel of Matthew, and what was interesting to me was like, wow, here's the Christmas story. It's like, growing up as a non-Christian with an Islamic background, I didn't know where the Christmas story came from. So that's what intrigued me and kept me reading. And then I hit the Sermon on the Mount, and that was the point where I recognized that Jesus must be who Christians claim him to be. Mm. I would argue I had a religious experience at that point reading through that passage of Scripture. Mm. And so it was a real encounter with the person of Christ. It was, I don't share this often, but it was as if there was a person in the room with me as I was reading the Sermon on the Mount, just as real as you're sitting across from me right now. Mm. And I've never had that feeling prior to that. I never had that feeling since then, but it was that presence and this overwhelming conviction that this is true that led me to then pick up a little booklet that Johnny had given me on how to become a Christian and going through that. So it was, God revealed through the record of nature and an encounter with the person of Christ in a very real way. Yeah. Through reading Scripture.
Yeah, and so not only for you did you have this, spiritual presence that you perceived, but when you read the Scripture itself, you thought, hey, this reflects who I am. This reflects reality.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the person of Jesus is extremely attractive.
Everyone likes him.
Yes. And when I'm reading the Sermon on the Mount, it's like what he's teaching here is true. This is how I want to live. But at the same time, he was condemning me. So here was this odd situation where I'm attracted to Jesus, but I'm feeling condemned by what he's teaching. Yeah. Right? And that's a really very powerful experience.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So that provides sort of a background into where you came from, your family, and what led you to faith in Christ. So then you decided you're going to go make a lot of money, and you worked for a Fortune 500 company. Yeah. What did you do? How long did you do it for? And then why did you decide you didn't want to make money anymore? So you went into apologetics ministry.
Yeah. Oh, you speak so much truth there. It's interesting. I always envisioned myself actually taking a post at a university, doing research in a university setting. And those doors were just not open to me, which was very frustrating. And so I accepted a job at the Procter & Gamble company and was actually delighted that it was really a very fun and interesting place to work. But I see this now in retrospect as a training ground because I learned something really valuable that translates, I think, to what I do now at Reasons to Believe. And that was, science is cool, but if it doesn't have practical utility in a company context, then we're not really interested. So I learned very quickly that what I had to pursue in science had to have practical utility for the company. And I learned how to begin to communicate scientific ideas to non-scientists. And I had a great time working at Procter & Gamble, but I felt God calling me basically into ministry. And it was partly encountering Creator in the Cosmos, written by Hugh Ross, that was part of that motivation. My father dying as a Muslim, that was another part of that motivation, where I realized evangelism is really important. But it was exposure to what Hugh Ross was doing at Reasons to Believe that gave me a vision for how, as a scientist, I could serve in ministry. And so became a volunteer with Reasons to Believe, and then contacted Hugh about the possibility of joining. And to my delight, Hugh was interested, and that's how I got involved in an apologetics ministry.
Yeah, great. So you're now the author of a number of different books. Tell us about those books, and if you see a sort of common theme that's woven between them.
Yeah, well, 3 books are actually somewhat of a trilogy of sorts: Origins of Life, The Cell's Design, and Creating Life in the Lab. And these are all dealing with the evidence that I saw over 30 years ago as a graduate student that convinced me there had to be a creator. And so what I look at in these books is trying to take that intuition of design and really formalize it into a comprehensive case for design at a molecular level. So Origins of Life is really critiquing the evolutionary models for chemical evolution. And that book was published in 2004, and I've gone back recently and reviewed it, and it's still, the content is still relevant to the origin of life question. The cell's design is taking those elegant features of the cell's chemistry and trying to articulate it into a formal case for design. And what I do there is kind of follow in William Paley's footsteps, looking at reinvigorating the watchmaker argument. And then the third book, Creating Life in the Lab, is dealing with the idea that we now are at the point where we're trying to create artificial cells and re-engineer life. And what does that tell us about the case for design? So there are really 3 prongs to a design argument that, when you put them together as a weight of evidence, you have basically the appearance of design, the inability to explain that design, and then what does it take to create that design in a laboratory. And all 3 point very powerfully to the work of an intelligent agent. And then another book that I've written is Who Was Adam, which is on the other extreme of biology, looking at the question of human origins. And I'm not trained in anthropology formally, but over the years I've taught myself anthropology. And to me, there's no more fascinating and important question than the origin of humanity. And at the time that I began working on the book, it was evident to me that many Christian apologists were just simply sidestepping that question, because anthropology is really complex. And you're looking through the glass dimly scientifically, you're looking through the glass dimly when you look at Scripture. And so we felt that this was really an important area that somebody needed to go in and begin to wrestle with. Can we produce a scientific argument for the traditional biblical understanding of human origins? And it's messy, and there are times where it's more challenging than I would like. And so, we had the courage or the stupidity to take on that question. I understand why a lot of people shy away from that question because it's so complex. But, to me, I felt like that was a really important topic that needed to be addressed. And to me, I think there's value in doing apologetics, even if at the end of the day the argument isn't buttoned down and nice and neat. I think it's very important for apologists to step into the messy issues with courage, because if we don't, then it communicates to nonbelievers that we're afraid. But if we really are confident that our faith is true, then we should step into those messy areas and really wrestle with those questions. And sometimes it doesn't always go well.
Yeah, I know even in my life the past few months, I've had situations where I've had to step in. And sadly, I think a lot of Christians are afraid to step into those messy areas, whether it's, even an apologetics discussion or more academic setting, writing books and getting involved with those issues, or just engaging society. Christians have been a bit fearful. But I found that when folks do that, when they get involved in those, messy areas, it encourages people, because they realize, no, we can defend our faith. We can have good reasons. We have good reasons to believe what we believe. And so it can be very encouraging and edifying for Christians when we do that. So that's a great point. So what role did design arguments play in deepening your faith?
Well, I mean, to me, as I mentioned, I was just absolutely intrigued with the ingenuity of biochemical systems. But, this was, again, over 30 years ago, and the more and more and more that we're learning about biochemistry, just the more incredibly elegant the case for a creator becomes from that design argument. Something that I find absolutely fascinating, and this is just a recent insight within the last decade, is that the enzymatic machinery in the cell that manipulates DNA during replication or transcription or DNA repair is literally functioning like a computer system at its basic level. I mean, you literally have these things called Turing machines that are involved in the process of DNA metabolism. And it was a computer scientist that recognized this, and the similarity is so astounding that he launched an entire new area of nanotechnology called DNA computing, right? And so this is like taking the watchmaker argument to the next level and the next level and the next level, right? Because, it's one thing to say, well, there's a similarity between a watch and a living organism, but to say that there's a similarity between the core operations of a cell and a computer system, so much so that we can literally build computer systems from DNA and enzymes is astounding. And in fact, those computer systems are more powerful than the most powerful supercomputer system, and they're found in these little tiny Eppendorf test tubes. And there are problems that you can solve only with DNA computing that you can't solve with traditional. So when you think about that, it's like, and the thing is, these ideas of Turing machines are abstract machines that Alan Turing, as a mathematician, conceived to create the theoretical framework to build the first computer systems. So these are not even analogies between actual machines and human designs. These are analogies between an abstract human machine and what we see in biochemistry. Yeah. So to me, it's mind-boggling, right? It's absolutely mind-boggling. But that's the type of thing that we continue to discover. Is that level of depth to design.
That's great. So you've had the opportunity to travel in your vow of poverty in the apologetics field. So you've been over to the Middle East and you've been able to present to Muslims. So what was that like, and what was the reception that you received?
Yeah, well, this is something that to me is one of those doors that God opened that I could never even imagine happening. But a couple of years ago, out of the blue on Facebook through the message function, I got an invitation from a Muslim to come to Turkey, to Istanbul, to take part in a conference where they were going to present the case for creation and challenges to evolution. And so I wrote back to them and I said, because my name is Islamic, is an Islamic name, Fazal is a good Muslim name. I wrote back to them and I said, you understand that I'm a Christian, right? I'm not a Muslim, because they had read some of my books, and they said, yeah, we know that you're a Christian. In fact, some of our best friends are Christians. So this, so I was like, okay, and so I wrestled with should I do this, and I finally said, well, I'm just going to take the step, and so so not only me, but Jeff Zwirink and A.J. Roberts from Reasons to Believe went, and we did this conference where we spoke in front of a Muslim audience presenting a Christian perspective on the case for a creator and challenges to evolution. And we've gone back a second time, and we're actually building a friendship with these Islamic creationists where the common ground that we're finding is our commitment to the notion that there is a creator and challenges to atheistic ideologies. And this is a wonderful platform to build friendships that open up opportunities for us to explain to Muslims, not only the people that we're building friendships with, but to audiences at large, what Christianity is and what it isn't. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding among Muslims. And we're learning a lot about what Islam is about. And to me, what's really encouraging is we hear so much about fundamentalist Islam today, but there's a large group of Muslims throughout the world that are moderate, that are progressive, that are looking at bringing Islam into a modern context, that want to be in good relationships with Jews and Christians. They see them as allies in a larger cultural context. And so, to me, I think science is a powerful tool to build a bridge into the Islamic world in a way that we have points of agreement that then allow us to talk about our differences, but talk about our differences from the standpoint of friendships rather than from a position of animosity and mistrust. And so it's an exciting opportunity that is hard to believe,
Yeah, that's great. Just 2 weeks ago, I believe, we did an episode on Islam. We had Dr. Andy Bannister on, and we were learning that it's really good for us to engage in dialogue, constructive dialogue with our Muslim neighbors. And they like to talk about religion, and some of them might be interested in science. And there's a history of scientific thought and even philosophical theology in Islamic history, and so some of them have that interest. And you're right; it's we shouldn't be afraid to go and talk to them about these issues. Some of them might like it and gain a further respect because they know that we're religious people, and if they're religious people.
Well, one of the things that's surprising to me, but in retrospect it shouldn't be, is again, Christianity has a really black eye in the Islamic world. And so Muslims are surprised to find that there are Christians that are devout, that are people of high morality, because the claim is the United States is a Christian nation. Well, look at the media that we produce. Look what comes out of Hollywood. Look what's on TV. Look at the things that are happening in our culture that are being broadcast around the world. And so if you say, well, the United States is a Christian nation, but this is what Christianity is about, there's a real misunderstanding of what Christianity really entails. And so just to be able to correct that is shocking to people, as Muslims.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more.
Hello, I'm David Smith, the Executive Director of Illinois Family Institute, a state-based Christian pro-life and pro-family public policy organization. I want to invite you to join us as we seek to be salt and light to a dark and rapidly decaying culture. You can do that in a number of ways. For example, you can join our email list to get timely alerts and great cultural commentaries. You can like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, listen to our podcasts, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can attend one or more of the special events and forums we host in different parts of the state. We do all these things to encourage and equip Christians in Illinois. You see, we need you to help us fulfill our mission to boldly bring a biblical perspective to public policy. Our faith requires us to be bold, speak truthfully, and love our neighbors. Join us. Visit illinoisfamily.org to learn more.
All right, well, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. And I am here with Dr. Fuz Rana, and we're talking about the integration of science with our faith. And before we get back into our discussion, Fuz, I didn't tell you this, but this is part of the fun. After every break, we do a segment of the show called Rapid Questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to be asking you questions just kind of sporadic about sort of fun, nonsensical things sometimes, and things you like to do, favorite things, those sort of questions. So we're going to put 1 minute on the game clock here, and you have to answer as many questions as you can. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Goodwill.
Taco Bell or KFC?
KFC.
Where would you like to live?
Southern California.
What's your favorite sport?
Football.
What's your spouse's favorite holiday?
Probably Christmas.
What's your most hated sports franchise?
Oh, goodness. It would be the Los Angeles Dodgers.
What is your favorite movie?
I love The Imitation Game about Alan Turing.
Yeah. Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
Diet Dr. Pepper.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah. Have you ever driven on the other side of the road?
Not on purpose.
What's the one thing that you'd be sure to keep with you if you were on a stranded island?
Oh, I'd love to have a Bible.
A Bible, all right. Which celebrity are you most like?
Gosh.
All right. Dr. Fuz Rana, thank you for playing a round of rapid questions. That can be a hard one, the celebrity question. It throws people off. You're like, oh, wait, I need to think of another person. So good. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm glad we got to know you a little bit more there, too. And the Bible answer is always a safe question about the stranded island.
Yeah, always Jesus or the Bible, right?
Yeah, that's right. But then again, if you had like a phone with a solar panel on the back, then you could have your Bible app plus like games, and it would power itself.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. All right. Now, before we kick back into the discussion today, just a couple announcements here. I know today I won't be answering some of your listener questions. If you want to submit a question and have it answered on the show, you can. There are a couple ways you can do that. You can text me. Just text the word Veracity to the number 555-888. Just text Veracity to 555-888, and you'll sign up for our free list, and you can text me that way. You can also email me, kurt@veracityhill.com. So I'll be answering, this past week there were a couple of submissions. I'll be answering those on next week's show, which will, I presume, be back in our studio. Okay, so that said, now, Fuz, so we were talking about your background, your upbringing, your interest in science, and the how science has deepened your faith. And so you've had the opportunity to travel. You've gone to Muslim countries and spoken on that. What has been your reception? How have your published works been received in the scientific academic community?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, one of the things that I find is that there's so much animosity within the scientific community towards the idea of intelligent design that oftentimes I think that spills over in terms of actually evaluating the work from Christian apologists who are building a case for design, whether it's people that are part of the ID movement or old earth creationists such as myself. But what's interesting is that in spite of those kind of negative brush-offs that oftentimes are received, where oftentimes I feel like people are critiquing the work, but they've actually not really engaged it. It's more of a caricature of what we've presented. We have been able to take our ideas and actually get a hearing for them in the scientific arena. For example, in the book Origins of Life, we took one of the chapters in that book where we critique the evolutionary models for the origin of cell membranes, and I worked with another chemist, and we turned that chapter into a critical review that was published in Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres, which is a leading journal in origin of life research. So the ideas that were in that book, at least some of those ideas, were actually submitted for peer review evaluation and were considered to be significant enough that the origin of life community was willing to publish that critique. The content in creating life in the lab and the idea that intelligent agency is required to create protocells or even to carry out prebiotic chemistry reactions is an idea that I find to be actually very well received when I've engaged origin of life researchers on one-on-one conversations where they almost invariably admit that that's an incredibly good point. And so while in public there's a lot of times a dismissal of the work, what I find is that there are places where when the work actually gets a fair hearing, there's generally a positive response to what we're doing there.
That's great. And now on Thursday, you were just at a college campus. Well, how do college students receive your talks?
It's interesting. Generally, pretty well. Again, we see the same polarization that we see in our culture. You see on a college campus, and so a lot of times, if I'm doing a debate, there will be a group of students that are from the atheist groups on the campus that you're not going to ever persuade them, at least publicly, they're not going to acknowledge that. Yeah. You
hope at least they go home and Google, Fuz Rana.
You hope they think about it.
Yeah.
A lot of times, my goal, like in a debate, is not so much to win the debate, but to actually make sure that the ideas that I hold to are presented in a clear enough way that people can engage them. And I remember a number of years ago doing a debate in Vancouver. It was actually a series of debates with atheists that were minor celebrities in the Vancouver area. So they attracted the atheist groups out. And after the last debate, we were packing everything up, and this older lady came up to me, very grandmotherly, and just the sweetest lady in the world. She was an atheist, and she said to me, I can't believe that you're a Christian because you're just so intelligent. And then she gave me a big hug, and then walked away. And to me, I take that as being success because I put a big rock in her shoe, to use Greg Kokel's words. That I blasted out of the water the stereotype she had of Christians and the fact that there's not a scientific case that can be presented for the Christian faith. I may not have convinced her, but I've made it uncomfortable with her to hold this position that atheism is the intellectually superior viewpoint. And so that's what I try to do in debates. And I think there are students that recognize that. And again, there are other students that are just entrenched in their framework and they're not going to budge. But hopefully you can at least, again, challenge a stereotype.
Yeah, so now part of your work has been to challenge, and I'm not a super science buff, so you have to forgive me here if I'm using some technical terms, it has been to challenge the Darwinian or perhaps neo-Darwinian naturalistic evolutionary framework. Yeah. What do you think are some of the common arguments that we should use and employ in disputing that framework?
Yeah. To me, one of the things I think we have to be careful about as Christian apologists is to get so overwhelmed with the evolutionary paradigm that's our sole focus of our apologetic is to attack the evolutionary paradigm. To me, I prefer making a positive case for design and then sprinkle that positive case with just enough critique of the evolutionary paradigm to raise suspicion or skepticism that the evolutionary paradigm is sufficient to explain the origin and the history and the design of life. Mm-hmm. So to me, I'm circumspect about where I go after the evolutionary paradigm, and I try to find places where I know that there are evolutionary biologists that have expressed skepticism about the evolutionary paradigm's capacity to account for a particular transition. So I love to go to the origin of life because almost everybody universally agrees that we don't have an explanation for the origin of life. So we're not disputing that deficiency in the evolutionary paradigm. Yeah. But there are major transitions in the history of life that evolution can't account for. The origin of eukaryotic cells. I mean, there's a model that people have as the mainstream model, but that model is deficient, and you can find evolutionary biologists decrying that deficiency, or the origin of body plans, the origin of consciousness. So these are places where we can go where the critique is non-controversial. And that's a great place to go, because then at that point what you're able to do is argue that, look, the evolutionary paradigm isn't the grand unifying theory in biology as the claim is, that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution, because you've got these major transitions in life's history that we can't account for. And so that to me is a great way to critique. And when you're coupling that critique with, again, a positive case, you've got a very powerful weight of evidence that suggests that at minimum design should be considered as a viable way to explain biology.
Now, you've also made it a point to say that, well, Christians shouldn't chiefly or solely focus on critiquing that framework, that we should get involved in other areas. Perhaps you could explain why.
Yeah. Well, I oftentimes what I see Christian apologists slipping into, and when you point it out, I think they recognize it and they don't want to go down that path, because the specter of Darwinism is so influential and so much a challenge to, I think, a Christian worldview. That there's a tendency to focus on trying to undermine that. But what you end up doing is making largely a negative argument, where you're saying that, well, if we can't explain evolution, then it must be design. And it leaves you vulnerable, if you're not careful how you frame that argument, to a God of the gaps critique on the part of atheists. Yeah. And so they're going to dismiss what you have to say. I think it's important that we do critique evolution because of the blind watchmaker claim, but I think we don't just solely want to critique the argument, the evolutionary paradigm. We want to construct a broader argument.
Yeah, because if we focus so much on the objections to it without offering an alternative, it comes across as, well, I don't know, therefore it must be God, which is God of the gaps, versus, hey, let's look at this awesome system. Yeah. It's so intelligently designed. I mean, even we humans, we boast when we create an intelligent design, and here we've got this thing. It's like, oh my gosh, this is evidence. This is God's handiwork. Yeah. That's His signature in creation. So we can't ignore that. Yeah. Right. That's a very good point. So you've brought up William Paley's watchmaker argument. You're an advocate for it. Explain. I know it's been given, a rough shake through the decades. Tell us why you like that argument.
Well, number one, I like the argument because it's a positive argument, and it's predicated on analogical reasoning.
Maybe we should first quickly explain what the watchmaker argument is. Yeah.
And Paley, this is an argument that traces back to the late 1700s, where Paley said, look, a watch has certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. It's made up of parts that are precisely interacting, that are framed together to accomplish a purpose. And you remove one part and that system doesn't work. Yep. And he said that this is a hallmark of human designs, and yet when we look at biological systems, we see those same properties. And so by analogy, if a watch requires a watchmaker, life must require a divine watchmaker. And the claim is, Darwinism is the blind watchmaker, and that David Hume undermined the logic of the watchmaker argument. Well, David Hume didn't undermine the logic of the watchmaker argument. He just simply said, look, if you're comparing things in an analogy, the more similar they are, the more certain the conclusion, the less similar, the less certain the conclusion. And he tried to argue that, a watch isn't the same thing as a living organism, and so therefore the watchmaker argument doesn't carry the thrust with it. But this is where biochemistry now revitalizes the watchmaker argument, because we can show, again, just going to the origin of life, that when it comes to explaining biochemical systems, that's the origin of life problem. The blind watchmaker doesn't seem to work. And it's not just that we now have so many examples of biochemical systems that are so much like human designs, these molecular machines that are eerie in terms of their similarity to human designs. I mentioned the computer systems that reside at the heart of the cell. Yeah. There's so many things where these systems literally are identical to human designs. And in fact, in certain areas of nanotechnology, there are scientists that are trying to basically harvest the machines from the cell and interface them into nanomachines that they're building, which is really illustrating that these actually are machines in every sense of the word. So I think it's a powerful argument that is rejuvenated by advances in biochemistry, but I find it to be pretty accessible to lay people, because we're accustomed to thinking in analogical terms. That's how we think all the time. We make most of the decisions analogically, and for lay people, when you can show them a protein complex that's identical to a motor, or you can show people that this is functioning like a computer system, I think people can grasp that argument. So it's an argument that I think lay people can grasp fairly easy. So and it's intuitive to people, right? It's intuitive to people.
Yeah, great. So one of the objections against the intelligent design arguments is that there is what's called bad evolution. Could you explain what is bad evolution, and how would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, well, that to me, if there's an argument...
I should say bad design. I'm sorry, I said bad design.
Well, bad evolution. But to me, if there is a legitimate challenge to the design argument, it's what appear to be flawed designs in nature.
Yeah.
And in fact, I devote an entire chapter in the Cell's Design to responding to that. And oftentimes, what I find is those examples of so-called bad design turn out to be very complex systems that are not well understood. And you have the declaration of a bad design being made on the authority of a skeptic.
Could you give us an example? What would be one example of a bad design?
One example that's the quintessential example would be so-called junk DNA in the human genome. Right. These are non-functional. This is non-functional DNA that reflects this unguided evolutionary history, presumably that humanity, underwent with regard to our origins.
Yeah.
But as we learn more about the so-called junk DNA, we're finding that that the junk DNA sequences are functional and they're part of an incredibly sophisticated regulatory network that is necessary to turn the information in the genome into a living organism.
So we're discovering that if we continue observing, we will learn. And so in this case, the people that have objected to the bad design, they're the ones that have given up on science almost, right? Because they've stopped doing science.
Exactly. And in other instances, what people declare to be bad designs are really an example where the system is facing a trade-off. And this is, if anybody's an engineer, they know that trade-offs are part of designing complex systems. And so it's not a bad design, but it's an example of a trade-off. And when you examine the nature of the trade-off, again, you see this elegance and this ingenuity. And so I've never seen any instance of a bad design actually withstand ongoing scrutiny. So, that to me is, again, a legitimate challenge, but I think there are ways to respond to that.
What do you think are some of the positive and negative arguments for design? So just basically pros and cons.
Yeah. To me, I'm not quite sure
So if you had to give someone, say, a 60-second,
Okay.
Here are 3 good arguments for design. Here are 3, here are the responses, and maybe why those are.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, to me, I would say that, again, just the elegance of biological systems.
Okay.
The fact that biological systems can inspire new engineering, new designs, new technology. Yeah. This is an area called biomimetics and bioinspiration. I think this is a very powerful new area that apologists are just beginning to explore that I think has a lot of fruit associated with it. I would also argue that, those would be the 2 main thrusts, I would say, just the appearance of design and the fact that design can really inspire new designs. Sure. And to me, the challenge, again, would be the origin of life problem.
Right.
And the fact that the critiques of the design argument at the end of the day are primarily theological in nature. They're actually not scientific.
Okay. So what are some common objections that you might hear if you're engaging? What would be sort of the top 2 or top 3 objections?
Well, to me, the one objection that shows up all the time is that design isn't science. Okay. Right? And of course, you can easily show that there are disciplines in science that employ intelligent design. But what's going on there is if we can label something as non-scientific, then somehow the case for the truth of that claim is illegitimate because science is the only legitimate way of knowing.
Yeah.
But that's a common objection. Okay. Where people try to sidestep it. And another objection would be, well, we've got an explanation for this. So there's a difference between having a scientific model and that model actually being valid. But for many skeptics, they feel as if they can come to the table with a model that the fact that they can even conceive of a plausible naturalistic explanation somehow means that must be the explanation, and they can dismiss the case for design.
Would you say that the problem there is in recognizing you've got a how for the model, but you don't have a why for the model?
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of times the complaints are not really scientific, but there's other things that are going on
philosophical or theological
Yeah.
assumptions. Yeah, good. All right, just a couple more questions for you here. How have you used the arguments for design in conversations with non-believers?
Well, I guess I have the advantage of working for Reasons to Believe, and so when people ask me, like on an airplane, where are you going? Well, I'm going to Chicago. For business or pleasure. Well, I'm speaking.
Oh, both.
I'm speaking. At a university, and I'm giving this talk.
Yeah.
And so it's a great way just to open up. And a lot of times people are intrigued because they have the common narrative is that science and faith don't belong together.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people are really intrigued, and that just leads to great conversations. And then just to be able to use the watchmaker type of analogies, talking about computer systems or...
Yeah, because some of this science might be over their head, but everyone knows that a watch is an intricately designed
so
item.
This is why I love the watchmaker argument. It's just great in everyday conversation.
Yeah, great. Okay, last question. What is the most fascinating discovery in biology that you have encountered that supports the God of the Bible?
Well, to me, I would say it's the design of the genetic code. And the genetic code is a set of rules that define the information in the cell. And when I was in graduate school, the perception was that the genetic code was a frozen accident. And this is based on the work of Francis Crick, who wrote a famous paper called On the Origin of the Genetic Code in the 1960s, where he argued that the genetic code has to be a frozen accident because a code like that can't evolve. Because if you start evolving the code, you basically are going to impact every protein in the cell. By changing those coding rules, you're going to render essentially all the proteins non-functional in the cell. It's lethal to have code evolution. And yet we've discovered in the last decade and a half that the genetic code is actually got a very elegant set of rules that don't look like they are frozen accidents, but are exquisitely designed to actually minimize error in data transmission. And it's so extreme that it's impossible to envision how you would ever have the resources to find that genetic code in nature. But on top of that, scientists have also discovered that the genetic code is optimally designed to harbor overlapping codes. So it's not just coding information that allows DNA to produce proteins, but there are codes for histone binding, which is helping to organize the DNA into chromosomes. There are splicing. There's a splicing code. There's a transcription binding factor code. There's an epigenetic code. There are all these multiple codes stacked on the genetic code, and the fact that the code can do that and then at the same time is optimal for that, to me, is just mind-blowing. And so to me, if there's one piece of evidence that really indicates it's got to be a designer, that evolution can't account for that, for life, it would be the genetic code.
And perhaps it's the case that for the designer, I think what I like about design arguments is that it shows us that God is not just transcendent, but He's immanent.
Yes.
He's acting in creation. He's working here.
Yeah.
And so that's a notion, at least in for Western religions, that's an important aspect. I guess in Islam, God, Allah is not so immanent. He's very transcendent, but He's not here with us.
Yes. Well, another thing that I like about design arguments, and I think the watchmaker argument specifically, is it's easy to connect it to Christian theology, because it's so provocative to think that the designs that we produce as human designers have these remarkable analogs in the cell, and that these systems trace back to the very beginning of life on Earth, right?
Yeah.
Well before we even existed. And if we think about the fact that we're made in God's image, and that when we create, that somehow that image of God is manifested, it's not really surprising then that our designs would mimic the designs that we see in nature if they come from a mind.
Yeah.
So what I like about the watchmaker argument is it's easy to build a bridge to the idea of the image of God, and the fact that somehow there is a resonance between our mind and that divine mind. So
yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, Dr. Fuz Rana, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that does it for our show today. I'm grateful for the support of our patrons. Those are people that just chip in $5 or $10 a month to help the show move along. And for the partnerships that I have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. And thank you to our guest today, Dr. Fuz Rana, and for listening. And I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.